Sorry, that came in. Hi everyone. Welcome to this particular lecture. So this would be the lecture I would have given you in class on Wednesday, the 12th of November, coming immediately after the lectures on Marxist geography, radical feminist geography, and earlier on humanistic geography. So I'm going to look at a number of new ideas or approaches that emerged in geography in the wake of the 1970s. We're looking here more at the 1980s, early 1990s. There are a number of new approaches that they're quite different in some ways. There's ideas that are quite different, but in other ways, there's a certain overlap between these new approaches. Sometimes you call them new regional geography, sometimes you call them locality studies. There's an overlap between these approaches in that in some ways they're trying to bring together the best elements of humanistic geography and Marxist geography. So trying to get together these two approaches, which are really two very distinct, very different approaches. Humanistic geography is focused on individual human agency, the individual human. Marxist geography, by contrast, as I said before, while it's obviously focused on the emancipation of humans, its general approach is one that's more global in focus. It's not particularly interested about human emotions. It's not particularly interested in human agency because in the mindset of Marxist geographers, everything is being determined by hidden structures. In the case of Marxist geographers, the hidden structures are linked to capitalism. As we saw in the previous lecture, which I hope you've listened to by now, radical feminist geographers, the structures are linked to the patriarchy. So they're very different approaches, but a number of geographers, some of whom would have been viewed as Marxist geographers, for instance, in the 1970s, people like Massey, a number of these geographers tried to bring together ideas linked with humanistic geography and Marxist geography, trying to kind of get the best of both worlds. And I'm going to make this argument in a few minutes' time. It's almost like a greatest hits of 1970s geography, almost like a greatest hits. What works? Trying to see, okay, what works in humanistic geography? What ideas? Okay, humanistic geography is interested in place. Marxist geography is taking a more global perspective, but can we actually link these different perspectives together? Can we have an approach to geography that does take account of global trends, but also looks at what's happening at a more localized level, what's happening in specific regions or places? Now, as I'm going to discuss later on, the focus on places and regions is very different to that of traditional regional geography. So that's why we have this reference to new regional geography. You're not looking at places as if they're cut off from other places, as if regions exist almost in the vacuum, as if regions are these homogeneous regions where society and culture is more or less the same within that region. We're not looking at regions as if they're largely, as I said already, they're in a vacuum. They're largely existing almost independent of other places. So this is where we get sort of this idea of relational geographies. The idea that we understand places in terms of how they relate to other places. Anyway, let's not spoil the fun. So here's the suggested reading list. Now, unfortunately, I'm stuck down in County Laois. I haven't been up in the office, so I can't give you the exact specific page numbers that I suggest you should read in the newest edition of Creswell's book. The relevant pages in the first edition are there, and to be honest, I don't think they're going to change that much. So if you can get your hands in the first edition and you can read those, what is it, about 14, roughly 13, 14 pages, by all means, you're fine. If you look at this second edition, you're probably going to be looking at the last few pages in chapter 4. Chapter 4 which is the chapter that looks at regions. So the last few pages will focus more on the new ideas in terms of regional geography. And look at the first few pages in chapter 11, which is the chapter on relational geographies. Okay, hopefully that makes sense, guys. Other reading. So again, more so not for online exercises, but more so for the written assignment and more so for the exam. Try to do a little bit of reading as you're working through these recorded lectures, because the reading will stand to you when it comes to the written assignment, which is still a few weeks away, but again, it's now only a few weeks away. So that little bit of extra work you do in early November, when maybe you still don't have a lot of big deadlines coming in, that little bit of extra work will stand you in early December when things are going to be crazy, guys. And remember what I always say, even though I'm miles away, first class honours, they're made in November. And first class honours are particularly made at those points of November where assignment deadlines might not be due. Maybe there's a few of my horrible little online exercises due, but you don't have any big assignment deadlines due. And that's the time when you can do that bit of extra reading. And the reading makes a lot more sense. It makes a lot more sense when you're actually doing the reading at the same time as the lectures are taking place, or in your case, the same time as you're listening to the recorded lectures. Okay, so human geography in the late 1970s. There was a lot of things happening in human geography. If you looked at human geography in the 1930s, it was mainly traditional regional geography. Okay, there was two different strands, the French school, the German school, but it was generally mainly dominated by regional geography. A little bit more happening in the 50s and 60s, where you had that interesting, the emergence of spatial science, that interesting conflict for dominance between regional geography, the old style regional geography, and spatial science. But then in the 1970s, a lot of things were happening. You still had old style regional geography, less influential than it was a few decades before, but you still had, especially in a country like Ireland, you still had a number of people who would be viewed as still traditional regional geographers. Spatial science was still very strong and influential. You now had the new approaches emerging on the scene, behavioral geography, but perhaps the most significant of the approaches that had critiqued or challenged spatial science in terms of the lack of a human dimension was humanistic geography. On the other side of the spectrum, you had the radical geographies or the structuralist geographies, the most significant of which were Marxist geography and radical feminist geography. So of the different critiques, you could group them into two really, of these new approaches that emerged in the 70s. Behavioral, but it's more notably humanistic geography. The focus was on individual humans, human agency, human behavior, how humans experience the world, how they engage with the world. It was focused on the local dimension, and particularly the dimension of locally grounded knowledge. In other words, trying to get the views of local people, as opposed to outside researchers coming in and imposing their own views. It was an approach that was concerned more with understanding and subjective knowledge, as opposed to trying to explain, being more concerned with objective knowledge. And the big concept for humanistic geography was the concept of place. Again, a very different understanding of place to that of traditional regional geography, but the big concept was place. On the other hand, you had the structuralist approaches, the most significant of which, we've covered them in this module, Marxist geography, radical feminist geography. Big focus here on structure. So you're going to see this conflict between structures and human agency. For the structuralist approaches, Marxist geography, radical feminist geography, they see everything as being based around structures. Marxists are concerned with the structures associated with capitalism. Radical feminist geographers are concerned with the structures associated with the patriarchy. Now, again, just in case there's any confusion, folks, they do not support capitalism. The Marxist geographers are not in favor of capitalism. The radical feminist geographers are not in favor of the patriarchy. So they're trying to uncover these structures and challenge them and ultimately change or overthrow these structures. The feminist geographers and the Marxist geographers in the 1970s were actually, in a similar vein to spatial scientists, they were trying to develop global theories or universal laws. In other words, laws that could apply anywhere in the world. In the views, as I said in the lecture on Marxist, in the views of Marxist geographers, they said, well, capitalism affects every place on planet Earth. So it makes sense that we're trying to develop global theories. It makes sense that we're trying to look at capitalism as this global force. So there was a certain degree of science here, not this science that you might associate, the out-and-out science that you might particularly link with spatial science, but Marxist geographers and also feminist geographers in the 1970s and early 80s, they were trying to develop geographical laws. They were trying to explain. And for them, the concept of space, this more global perspective, made a lot more sense to them than the concept of place, because they said, look, we have issues with the concept of place, but we're also looking at global trends. We're looking at things that are happening in our views. We're looking at structures that are having impacts all over the world. So in our mindset, the concept of space makes more sense. We resonate more with this. Now, the concept of space for Marxist geographers and radical geographers was very different to the concept of space as understood with this kind of laboratory style understanding of the concept of space. The idea that spatial scientists, for instance, looked on space almost like this laboratory where you could do basically geographical experiments, where you could actually use space as this blank canvas, this container, where you try to tease out the impacts of movement, the impacts of distance on movements, on population flows, etc., etc. When you get to the 1970s, 1980s, you start to see a different understanding of space. You start to see the Marxist geographers in particular thinking and talking about the social construction of space. But space was the big concept for Marxist and radical feminist geographers. In the late 1970s, early 1980s, you start to see the humanistic and structuralist perspectives being critiqued from a number of perspectives, based on theories and philosophies that came from other subjects. The most significant theory probably that influenced this new geography was Anthony Giddens's structuration theory. Giddens was a sociologist. And the most significant philosophy was critical realism, which particularly impacted on the locality studies tradition. Now, my theory, and you can think about this, and I stress, you can think about this as you listen to the rest of this lecture. My theory is, if geography was almost reflecting what's happening in popular music at this point in time. Now, all of you, you're all very young. You're a lot younger than me. You're half my age. You have no understanding of what it's like to grow up in the 1980s, and this is the period we're looking at. The 1980s, as I said before, when I was talking about about the history of academic geography, when I was talking in the last few slides about the 1980s in Ireland, it was a miserable decade economically in the Republic of Ireland, and in other parts of the world as well. There was a lot of things going bad for people. You can think of people in the north of England, people in deindustrialized zones, kind of places like Baltimore, Boston, USA. Economically, people were having a very bad time. A lot of people were having a very bad time in the 1980s. Not everyone, but a lot of people. In other parts of the developed world, the south of England, London and the south of England, in the 1980s, under Margaret Thatcher, went into a period of economic boom. So the world was changing. The world economy was changing. The old industrial zones were in decline. Places like Ireland, but also other parts of Europe like Portugal, Greece, they were in an economic sinkhole. There was nothing happening. If you were growing up in Ireland in the 1980s, you realized we're in a country where we've got very high levels of employment, very few job prospects, high levels of inflation, there's nothing here. And in the early to mid 1980s, you just basically felt that was it. That was it. The one good thing about the 1980s was the music was bloody good in the 1980s. The problem was people didn't have a lot of money to buy music in the 1980s. And that's why when this series, that's what I call music series, emerged in the 1980s, it was kind of like almost the best thing since sliced bread, guys. What was now you've got Spotify, you can basically listen to music whenever you want, but you couldn't do that in the 1980s. Obviously, the idea of listening to music on your computer was a crazy thing to think of. The compact disc, the CD was starting to come on stream. Like, that was high powered, that was kind of crazy levels of technology for us growing up in the 80s. Many of us were just relying on the old cassette recorders. What did Now That's What I Call Music series do for people? It meant that you got this CD, or for most of us, cassette, where you had a number of the top hits. You had I wouldn't say all, but most of the top hits over a certain period of time were all on the same album. So for people who weren't diehard, say, Black Sabbath or diehard Duran Duran fans, people who just like music in general, and I'll include myself amongst this list, people who just like music, who might like a bit of pop, might like a little bit of heavy metal, might like a little bit of disco, just like popular songs, just like good songs. And there was a lot of good songs in the 1980s. This was the best thing, as I said, since sliced bread. You could listen to a bit of Duran Duran, a bit of Madness, a bit of Bananarama. All the top hits, nearly all of the top hits, were on this album. It was kind of the best. You got the best of music on the one album. And I like to think that the 1980s, the new approaches in Georgie in the 1980s were a bit like that. They were offering the greatest hits of different types, different approaches in Georgie. They were almost saying, like, okay, we're not going to be stuck down an ideological rabbit hole. If we think quantitative approaches and qualitative approaches have positive dimensions, we're going to try and do our research in such a way that we're going to have a certain element of quantitative geography or quantitative geographical research work done here, but we will also add qualitative methods to our research. If we think there's good and bad elements associated with different approaches, we'll try and draw in some of the better elements of these approaches. So if you look at a lot of the approaches and a lot of the methodologies associated with these approaches, you see this becoming very much part and parcel of these geographies. I hope I'm making sense. Probably not, but it's basically like one of the top hits in this period in the 1980s, Ebony and Ivory. There's good and bad in everyone. We learn to live when we learn to give each other what we need to survive. So the idea that you can actually draw positive elements from quantitative approaches to geography and qualitative approaches. So what you see in the 1980s, you see a growing move towards mixed methods approaches. And we particularly get that with kind of forms of exploratory data analysis, where you say, look, if we want to look at a certain topic or a certain question, let's do a number of things. Let's not just focus solely on methods that we might associate with humanistic geography, or methods that we might associate with Marxist geography, or methods that we might associate with spatial science. Let's take the best of all these worlds. Let's take a bit of spatial science. Let's start off by doing some statistical work. Let's start by looking at all the data that's readily available on this particular topic or in relation to this question. We'll do some analysis. We might even map the data. Let's see what the general trends are. And then moving on, we'll look at those trends, we'll do a bit of reading, and we'll move on then to kind of really hone in on what we think are the big questions here. What are the big questions that are thrown up when we look at these trends, when we look at these maps, when we look at these patterns? And we'll move on then to a more intensive, localized case study analysis using qualitative methods to tease out these questions in more depth. So the idea that you're taking the best thing out of different approaches to human geography. And it sort of reflects the politics as well of the 1980s, but particularly the 1990s. It's a more conciliatory politics. You move away from kind of the more harder left-wing politics that might have been evident in the 1970s, the harder right-wing politics that were more dominant in the 1980s. And the 1990s politics was more sort of like a centrist, midway or third way politics, where it really was a period that was dominated more by center-left politics as opposed to what we see today. So Giddens' structuration theory, don't get too worried about, if you're doing geography and sociology, you're going to know more about this theory than I do, I'll be honest. But don't get too bogged down in the nitty-gritty of the actual theories. All you need to know from the theories is try to get a handle or understanding in terms of how these ideas might have impacted on human geography in the 1980s and 1990s. So Giddens' structuration theory is one of the theories that flows into new regional geography and the locality studies tradition. And the man associated with this theory is Anthony Giddens, who was a sociologist. In this theory, he suggests that universal theories, such as Marxism, he says, okay, they have some positive elements, but they really offer nothing in terms of understanding of the individual agent. Giddens says, okay, there's some value here. We can talk about structures, but he says this idea that we have this kind of hidden superstructure, he didn't really buy it. He says structures are created and implicated in each and every human action. He also suggests that this idea that he says, okay, the worldview according to Marxism and radical feminist geography, radical feminism would be that structures are constraining. So the capitalist structure constrains humanity. The patriarchal structure constrains humanity, particularly women. But Giddens says maybe some structures can be enabling as well as constraining. And the last point is made that individuals can modify structures. So in some ways, Giddens is kind of suggesting that maybe the worldview of Marxist geography almost, in some ways, was almost like that of environmental determinism, the idea that capitalism was determining everyone, that unless you overthrow capitalism, people are ultimately prisoners of capitalism. The idea in Marxist geography that human agency doesn't really matter because everywhere and anywhere is shaped by the capitalist system. Giddens says, come on, okay, I think there's value in what the Marxist approach is suggesting, but this idea that people are prisoners of structures says, no, individuals can modify structures, albeit he suggests, depending on their position in society. So obviously, more powerful people have a greater level of influence here that other less powerful people would have. Anyway, that's my take, very, very layperson's take on structuration theory. And apologies to the geography sociology students among you who have a much more nuanced take on this. Structuration theory, it particularly starts to influence the work of economic geographers in the 1980s, particularly those operating in the locality studies tradition or the new regional geographers that emerged in the same period as well. Where it does impact on geography is it starts to encourage geographers to bring together the opposing trends of Marxism and its focus on structures and humanism or humanistic geography and its focus on human agency. And a geographer called Nigel Thrift, a leading person in new regional geography in the 1980s and 1990s, says this idea of structuration can act as a middle ground, a meeting point between geographers who are more focused on human agency, namely the humanistic geographers, and geographers who are more influenced or more focused on structures, namely those in Marxist geography and radical feminist geography. The other big outside influence on geography came from a philosophy called critical realism. It claims that the empiricist view, which assumes that the world is as we experience it, is mistaken. Now, what's interesting here with critical realism, in some ways it almost overlaps with structuration theory. It notes that there are different conceptions of society. Individualistic conceptions of society, which we would probably see as part and parcel of the humanistic understanding or humanistic approach to geography, and collectivist conceptions of society, which we might see as more associated with Marxist geography, radical feminist geography, particularly those approaches to geography that align more with the social sciences. It argues that attempts to find a middle ground between these may diminish the relative autonomy of the different conceptions. But critical realism does try to bring these together. So as Pauline Cooper notes in her book, critical realism allows for both of these to exist, to be taken account of in the same analysis. So critical realism allows for both structure or the insights that we might associate with Marxist geography and radical feminist geography, and agency, or the insights that we would associate with humanistic geography, recognizing the interactions of these two different understandings or these two different approaches. As it suggests, societies and people are two distinct kinds of entity, both existing at the same time and each influencing the other. Our actions are always in the context of social structures that pre-exist. So what was the impact of critical realism on geographies? The main impact has to do with methodology, and it lends itself very nicely to a mixed methodology approach to geography. And I'll be honest, I bloody love mixed methodology approaches. As anyone who's been a student of mine who's done research for me in GY310B or for the single major thesis will understand. So the critical realist geography requires a methodology that demands a combination of abstraction with both intensive research. So intensive research is localized case study based research, generally more focused on qualitative research methods, and extensive empirical research. So that's more kind of research that's looking at the bigger picture, research that's probably more likely to make use of data, research that's probably more likely to involve quantitative research methods. So there's three different steps. The first step in a critical realist geographical methodology would involve extensive large-scale research. And this is where you're looking at the data that already exists and you're trying to find patterns or trends in this data. You might start off your research on a topic with a specific question that you're interested in. But the idea here is if you start by looking at the data that already exists in relation to this topic or this theme, this might throw up some other ideas or some other questions. So you might have a kind of an assumption of what the big question is, and then you map the data, and suddenly you kind of say, hang on a second, look at the trends in this data. So if you're looking at Ireland, you might say, hang on a second, I'm seeing very high levels. I didn't expect this, but I'm seeing very high levels in relation to this factor, say, in the west of Ireland, and very, very low levels in the east of Ireland, and particularly in Dublin. So am I seeing an urban-rural dimension here? And if so, why am I seeing this urban-rural dimension? So the idea that you map the data, and this starts throwing up other questions that you might not have thought of before you started to map this. The next stage then in a critical realist geographical methodology is abstraction. You have your big question, but you might now have some other questions. You're now based on your quantitative research or your data work or your mapping. You might now have other questions that you're actually interested in answering. Next thing to do, it's suggested, is go to the academic literature. Abstraction. Engage with the existing literature. Say, okay, maybe there's been other research on this topic. Maybe there's some good theoretical literature there that might offer me a framework to use in terms of my methodology or in terms of my general approach to this topic. And this then allows you to start developing theories, developing questions. So theories, as I said before, they sound very faffy, very highfalutin, but theories really are hunches, questions. So you now might say, okay, I have a few theories as to what's happening here. I have a few questions. So you might now, having done your data work and now engaged with the academic literature, you're now at a stage where you have certain theories as to what's happening or might be happening. And this leads you on then to develop your final list of research questions. Your big research question, your research aim, which is generally kind of more out there, more general in scope, and your research objectives, the 3 or 4 smaller research questions, which link back to your research aim, which are they're more easier to answer, or they're more feasible to answer. And these are the questions you're now going to move on to try to answer when you move on to the last stage of your methodology. And the last stage of a critical realist geographical methodology is where you carry out intensive empirical work. This is generally based on a specific place, so it's a case study analysis. And this generally will probably involve a lot more qualitative research work. You might now start doing more interviews. You might now start doing more questionnaire surveys. So this is where you finally test out and refine the ideas. Now, the quite interesting thing about this is it's a case study. It's based on a specific area. So you're seeing different dimensions here. The first phase, the big work at the start on data analysis, that's looking at a more kind of global trend. So this is really space. This is really geographical work that's more interested in the concept of space. When you move to the very end of the process, when you're getting down to the level of case study analysis, intensive empirical work, intensive qualitative work, by this stage, you're now engaging with the concept of space. So that's one thing to note. This approach, these approaches that I'm talking about, they're just as interested in the concept of space as they're interested in the concept of place. So they're trying to marry together different scales or different levels of geographical analysis. The global dimension, maybe a more national dimension, but also the more local dimension. I was actually doing a lot of hand movements there, but I just realized you can't see those hand movements. Probably for the better. Anyway. Now, structuralist geographers, as I said before, had big concerns with place. For structuralist geographers, really, Marxist geographers, radical feminist geographers, on one dimension, place didn't really matter in their worldview because they said, look, we're looking at global trends. The patriarchy applies all over the world. Capitalism impacts all over the world. So it makes more sense for us to be looking at the global trends, the big picture. It makes more sense for us to be teasing out global theories or meta-narratives. But they also had other issues with place, and I mentioned these already. Harvey's concern with place, he says, like it can lead to certain nostalgic hang-ups with place, romanticization of place, which in turn leads to kind of localized place-based politics, place-based reactionary politics that distracts people from the bigger picture. And the bigger picture for Harvey is the class struggle, the fight against capitalism. For feminist geographers, the radical feminist geographers, their big concern with place was the fact that, to say, humanistic geographers, they have this kind of rose-tinted view of place. This rose-tinted view of place, as you see with people like Ifu Tuan, topophilia, the love, the affective attachment people have with place. They say humanistic geographers have this rose-tinted view of place, but they say, hang on a second, places can be oppressive. And places can be particularly oppressive for women because their home places or their actual homes could be places of oppression. The new geographies in the 1980s try to marry together those geographers who are more interested in space, namely in the 1970s the Marxist geographers and the radical feminist geographers, but also the spatial scientists, and those geographers who in the 1970s were more interested in the concept of place, namely the humanistic geographers. So we see this in different types of geography that emerge in the 1980s and the 1990s. One of these is what's called new regional geography, and particularly associated with a geographer called Nigel Thrift. Nigel Thrift uses Giddens's ideas, he applies Giddens's ideas, Giddens's structurationist viewpoints to argue for a reconstituted regional geography, what becomes known as new regional geography. And as a regional geography, it's very different to the old style traditional regional geography. This is why I keep referring to regional geography sometimes in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s as traditional regional geography. Thrift's new regional geography has certain overlaps with Marxist geography. Just like Marxist geography, there's a theoretical element to Thrift's regional geography, but there's also an emancipatory element. Like Thrift sees his new regional geography as there to challenge the status quo, to emancipate society. So it's not just about describing places and regions. Thrift says it's important to try and look on the region as a setting for interaction, or as we'll see with John Agnew's ideas later on, this understanding of the region as a locale. So one thing we're going to see in these geographies, different geographies, is there different ways of looking at places or at the region. So Thrift talks about the region as being a locale, a setting for interaction. But ultimately, the emphasis of the new regional geography should be on the region as a basis for social action. So this emancipatory dimension. New regional geography brings back a focus on the region and local particularity or local uniqueness as key aspects of geographical thinking. So the region, as I said, as old style or traditional regional geography started to lose its influence, the region as such, now there was a focus on places in humanistic geography, but not particularly on the region. The new regional geography approach brings back this focus on regions and local uniqueness as key aspects of geographical thinking, but a very different understanding to that of traditional regional geography. What new regional geography allows is for this kind of focus on how the different levels or the different scales of geography interlink with one another. So it's looking at the different geographical scale, how the macro level can link with the micro level, how general macro scale trends, general global or macro scale trends can link with more localized trends, how the general and particular can relate to one another. Ultimately, the big question for new regional geography, and new regional geography as such was probably most significant in terms of the subdiscipline of economic geography. New regional geographers were really interested, and we'll see this again when we look at Dorian Massey's work. New regional geographers were really interested in how local places fitted in within wider global trends, particularly wider trends within global capitalism. And in the 1980s, the big question that we're all interested in was, how are different places impacted by, but also interacting with, the trend of global economic restructuring? Another key, very similar in some ways to new regional geography, it's slightly different. Another type of geography or school of geography that emerges in the 1980s, particularly in Great Britain, is the locality study school. And this is particularly associated with a geographer I mentioned briefly before, Dorian Massey. The locality school was particularly interested in how global economic restructuring was impacting on places, different places in Great Britain in the 1980s. Now, what was global economic restructuring? A quick explanation here. Global economic restructuring reflected a number of different trends. First of all, it was the breakup of the old Fordist model of production. Now, if you've probably heard this term before. If you haven't heard this term before, the Fordist model of production was one where you had very big factories and all the production process took place in these large factories. So it's basically the same model that Henry Ford used to produce his motor cars in the early 1900s. With global economic restructuring, you had the breaking up of the production process. So instead of all the production process taking place in the one factory, now you had different dimensions of the production process taking place in different parts of the world. Obviously helped by new developments in transportation technology, but also new developments in information and communications technology as well. So now, instead of all the production process taking place in a big factory, say in just outside a city in Britain, maybe now parts of that production process were now taking place in other parts of the world, particularly the developing world, where labor costs were cheaper. So a lot of the kind of the less technological, more labor intensive elements of the production process were now being more or less, effectively moved to other parts of the world, particularly parts of the developing world where labor costs were cheaper. The knock-on effect of this was that manufacturing employment in the developed world, including countries like Great Britain, manufacturing employment went into decline. Now, this loss of manufacturing employment, this collapse in manufacturing employment levels, was taking place at the same time as you were having an increase in employment in services, particularly in white collar employment, in services. So you were seeing overall a change in occupational structures in developed countries like Britain. And this had a geographical dimension. So more industrialized, the old traditional industrialized areas such as the north of England, the south of Wales, central Scotland, because of this loss of employment, because of this breaking up of employment, this was also taking place at a time when employment levels in the coal mines was falling into decline, when the old traditional industries such as steel production were going into decline. So there was a geographical dimension to this economic restructuring process. In some parts of Britain, for instance, the north of England, you were seeing a massive increase in unemployment, where you're seeing jobs being lost because steel plants were closing down or coal mines were closing down, but also because various factories were breaking up their production process and moving a lot of the production process to other parts of the world. So in some parts of Britain, this process of global economic restructuring brought in a massive increase in unemployment, and in some cases, permanent unemployment. In other parts of Britain, particularly where the services sector was much stronger, you were seeing a period of rapid economic growth, particularly the city of London and a number of the commuter towns in the south of England, places like Swindon, which basically became hubs for services employment growth. So Doreen Massey was particularly interested, and the Locality Study School was particularly interested in studying how global economic restructuring was impacting in Britain. And Massey's significant book here was a book published in 1984, Spatial Divisions of Labour. In this book, she highlights the importance of place, the particularity of place, in terms of its significance to the process of capitalist restructuring. So she's saying, look, this is not capitalist restructuring, global economic restructuring isn't having the same influence everywhere. Some places are going into economic decline, other places are going into a period of massive economic boom. So what is happening here? Why is this happening? So she's saying, okay, we have this global process, a global process that we usually associate traditionally with the concept of space. But she says to fully understand this global process, we need to see how it's playing out in different places or different regions. So on the other hand, highlighting the importance of the concept of place. So Massey's book linked regional problems, such as problems to do with increased unemployment in the south of Wales, the north of England, central Scotland. She linked these, in the book, she links these regional problems to economic restructuring and the new spatial divisions of labour. So the new spatial divisions of labour, particularly evident in different ways, manufacturing employment, a lot of that of the kind of the more labour intensive, cheaper, are moved to new locations. But at the same time, you're seeing in the developed world a rapid, massive increase in services-based employment, which she suggests are overlaid on and combined with the pattern produced in previous periods by different forms of spatial division. So she says, what's happening today doesn't occur in a vacuum. What happens today is also impacted by what went before. Why can't we have services-based employment in the north of England? Well, the problem is, where do you base this? Where are the greenfield sites? Instead, we've got brownfield sites. We've got cities in the north of England where a lot of the land is taken up by old industries, or basically a lot of the land is basically industrialized zones, areas where you've old declining industries, or basically also industries have closed down, but the plant is still there. So you have all these derelict sites. Services-based employment, where is it taking place? Apart from the City of London, a lot of the services-based employment is probably taking place in greenfield sites associated with cities in the south of England, such as Reading or Swindon, probably cities that really hadn't been hubs of economic growth up to that point in time. Now, Massey's spatial divisions of labour is interesting in two ways. First of all, it's, as I explained already, it's trying to make sense of global trends, the changing trends in global capitalism, but trying to understand them by making sense of them by looking at what's happening in different places or different regions in Great Britain. But it's also significant because it's a bridging point between the old style geographies of spatial science and regional geography and the new postmodern geographies that will start to emerge from the 1990s onwards. It almost kind of hints at or prefigures some of the questions that are going to be asked in postmodern geography. Questions to do with the role or the importance of local uniqueness, questions to do with the impact of global economic restructuring, more flexible processes of manufacturing, effectively what's called as the post-Fordist economic mode. And last of all, a critique of universalizing theories, a critique of big theories, global theories that claim to explain every part of the world. And some of these theories we'd associate with spatial science, but we would also associate these theories with Marxist geography as well. So during Massey's spatial divisions of labour, it's important. As I said, it changes geography, but particularly it changed economic geography. It moved economic geography away. Economic geography, probably up until the 70s, 80s, was still very much dominated by spatial science, particularly certain subsections of economic geography, such as industrial geography. So industrial geography, up to Massey's book, was still very much dominated by the location theory approach of spatial science. Massey's book moves industrial geography on and starts to say, look, let's get to grips with what's happening in terms of global economic restructuring. Many of the concepts and ideas in Massey's book are very much key concepts in economic geography today. If you've done work with Chris Van Egeret, hopefully, I might be wrong here because I don't know exactly what Chris does with you, but I presume you will have heard a lot about Dorian Massey's work, Dorian Massey's ideas, if you've taken any of Chris's modules. And Spatial Divisions of Labour also was the key book for the Locality Studies School, the Locality Studies project. It's as influential to that school as Harvey's Social Justice and the City was for the Marxist approach, as the work of the women of, I've forgotten the title, but the work of the Women's Study Group in Great Britain was for the emergence of radical feminist geography in the 1980s and early 1990s. So its focus, as I said, we've said this already, looking at place and place uniqueness, looking at regions once again in the face of global trends, the geographically uneven effects of globalization and time-space convergence. Now, was Dorian Massey's understanding of place? So Dorian Massey is saying regions are important. We should be looking at regions again. We should be looking at places. Okay, we are interested in the bigger picture. We are interested in global trends. But to make sense of those global trends, we should be looking at places again. But her understanding of place is very different to that of traditional regional geographers. There's slight variations with humanistic geographers as well. She has what's referred to here as a progressive concept of place. What does it say? It says the boundaries of places are open and porous. Regions and places are not existing in a vacuum. They're not cut off from each other. What's interesting about places is you're not interested in places in terms of how they're cut off from other places, but you're interested in places in terms of how they relate to other places. So the boundaries of places are viewed as open and porous. And she talks about there being many interrelationships, interlinkages, interdependencies between different places. So this idea that you're looking at places in terms of how they relate to other places. And when we look at Agnew's ideas at the end of this session, we'll see Agnew referring to place as a location. Places in terms of how they're linking to other places, how they're interrelating with other places. Massey also understands place in terms of the way she also draws in the humanistic perspective here. So she talks about the importance of attachment to place. And she says within places, there's different levels of attachment to place probably existing within the same place. Certain people probably have a strong attachment to that place, other people less so. And this can have an impact, not just on society, but maybe also economically as well. Last of all, she suggests there is no homogeneity within place. So you can't talk about people having the same culture, people having the same values. She says there is social and cultural differences all existing within the same place. Social and cultural heterogeneity exist within places. Okay, getting near the end, guys. And I've gone over 15 minutes again. I thought this would be about 40 minutes today. Last of all, I'll refer to someone else who's of this worldview, same worldview as Dorian Massey, but this is someone who's applying these ideas to political geography as opposed to economic geography. And this is a man called John Agnew, someone who's particularly influential on my own work, I'll be honest. So John Agnew writes a book called Place and Politics in 1987, which mainly uses Italy as a key case study. So Agnew says place is still important. Agnew's writing his book at a point in time where a lot of people are thinking about politics in terms of national politics. But Agnew says local places are still important in terms of understanding political behavior. He says political behavior is intrinsically geographical. But as such, you need a place-based perspective to fully understand political behavior. Agnew's understanding of place is one where he says place is a setting for interaction. He says we can talk about place in terms of the traditional way we understand places, in terms of what's happening in places, in terms of how people interact with each other in places. What's the economic activity in that place? What are the different social groups in that place? But he says this setting also must be located. So he says you can talk about place as a setting for action, but you can also talk about place as a location, as a place that's linked in with other places. Place is not just locale, a setting for activity or social interaction, but it's also location. The reproduction and transformation of social relations must take place somewhere. Now, in Place and Politics, he notes a place is identified as a specific element in structuration theory. So he's drawing ideas from Giddens' structuration theory. And his Place and Politics outlines a framework for a specific theory of place and political behavior. The one point, for those of you who aren't particularly interested in political geography, political behavior, the one thing that Agnew really suggests or offers that probably is of specific interest to those of you who are interested in human geography as in general, he says he has a concept of place. Well, it's a multi-dimensional concept of place, and it has three different interrelated elements. So Agnew thinks of place in three different dimensions. He thinks of place as locale. And this would be an understanding of place that we might be more likely to associate with traditional regional geography. So place as a setting for everyday social interactions. What's happening in that place, etc. Agnew also thinks about place in terms of place as location. Place as located in wider geographical space. How does that place relate to other places? How is that place shaped by forces coming from outside the place? How is that place impacted by regional forces, national forces, global forces? And how does that place in turn respond to these outside forces? So place is location. And that's an understanding of place that probably has a greater resonance with Marxist geography as such, as opposed to other approaches. The last dimension of place for Agnew in his work is sense of place. Obviously a dimension of place that we will probably more readily associate with humanistic geography. So at the level of attachment between people and place. So this is another interesting way of thinking about place. There's obvious resonance with Dorian Massey's understanding of place, obvious overlaps there. They're both geographers who are thinking, producing new ideas about place, more or less at the same time. But Agnew applies his understanding or his concept of place to political geography. Dorian Massey applies her progressive concept of place to economic geography and industrial geography. Okay, there was actually a lot more in that lecture than I thought I would. I've repeated myself a bit, but hopefully the fact I'm repeating myself means that I'm really underpinning the main ideas here. And sometimes you might hear an idea and you don't get it. Hopefully you better understand it the second or third time you get that idea. Now, as you might see on Moodle, and I'll email you about this at some stage anyway, what I'm doing with the online comprehension, next set of online comprehension exercises is I'm giving you an option. So online exercise 3 gives you an option between doing one based on the lecture on the history of Irish geography between 1930 and the 1970s, or the 2 lectures on humanistic geography and Marxist geography. Online assignment 4 gives you the option between doing this on the lecture I did for the 10th of November on radical feminist geography, or this particular lecture. The question associated with this particular lecture suggests that the approaches that we look at in this particular lecture could be viewed as human geography's version of the now That's Why I Call Music series. So think about that question. What did I mean by that? I talk about that at the start of the lecture. So I give you some ideas in terms of how you could approach this at the start of the lecture, but also think about what I've covered in the rest of the lecture. So what I'm looking for here, if you're taking this question, is a critical assessment of that statement. Now, at this stage, hopefully at this stage, you know what I'm looking for. It's usually make 3 or 4 arguments, which should be roughly, if you're typing them, 5, 6, 7, 8 sentences long. Make your point, explain it. 3 or 4 arguments, but make sure that some of your arguments, or at least one of your arguments, is in favor of the statement, and make sure that some of your arguments, or at least one of your arguments, is against the statement. So see how you get on with this question. If you're not doing the question on radical feminist geography, I think this is one that really allows you to be potentially quite creative, but try to make sure you're drawing in the ideas I've covered in this lecture, because if you're not, you're off the pint. Blah, blah, blah. So yeah, as for all the comprehension exercises, base it on what's covered in the lecture. You don't need to do any background reading for this. There's no expectation of that because these are meant to be short exercises. This is basically what I would normally be expecting you to do in the last 15 minutes of this particular lecture. How the hell I thought I was going to get 15 minutes at the end of this lecture, I don't know, because I talked for over nearly an hour on this. It's an individual exercise, so do it yourself, and I'll post marks on Moodle as soon as I can. It's going to take longer because a lot more of you are doing the online exercises than would be doing it if there were in-class exercises. So please be patient with me in terms of getting marks back on these. A reminder again that your overall final in-class exercise mark will be based on your best 4 attempts out of 6 or 7 in-class exercises. Now, chances are, if you were in class for in-class exercise 1, if you've done exercise 2, and you do exercise 3 and 4, at this point in time, you might have already 4 exercises done. So just to remind you all, there's no expectation that you're going to do all 6 or 7 of the exercises. If you do 5 or 6 or 7, the advantage to that is that the advantage there is that your lowest marks get excluded. But you might get, if you're done pretty well in exercises 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then you see, oh, look, here's another online exercise coming up. It's number 5. Here's another online exercise. If things get really bad, guys, sorry, and I'm still not back in minutes by December. Oh, here's an online exercise 6. Now, I don't blame anyone if you've done 4 exercises and you've got fairly good marks for this. If you decide to do, you know what? Here's online exercise 5, but I've already done 4 of them. The marks are pretty good. I've got this bloody assignment for Chris due this week, or I've got this bloody assignment due for Connor this week. I've too many things on my plate. There's no expectation on my part that you have to do all 6 or 7 of these. If you've got 4 done, you're not going to lose out on marks. Obviously, if you do 5 or 6 or 7, that allows you to lose the lowest mark. But I hope you get what I mean. Anyway, I've talked enough for today. Bye.